I want to know what you've done, what you're doing now.
Yeah.
Where is it taking you, the journey?
Yeah. Well, I mean, my training was sort of half in Europe, half in America.
Uh-huh.
So I always feel like I'm somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic in terms of where my background is musically. So in a way, I'm glad that it's like that, because I think it's very easy to just be based in one place and therefore only be inspired by one kind of way of making music. So, I mean, I try continuously to be active on both sides of the Atlantic for that reason as well. But in terms of right now, I mean, I'm trying to combine as much opera with as much concert repertoire as I can. And so, I mean, for example, right now, the next couple of months, I'm doing some concerts in Romania next month. And then immediately after that, I start a new production at Hamburg State Opera of a new chamber opera, which is actually, I've yet to receive the score. So we'll see how that turns out. But I mean, that's just a good example of, that's 2.5 months of my sort of schedule. And it's a nice combination of both concerts and opera, as well as being some newer music. And then I'm doing the Algar Enigma Variations in Romania with the Schumann Piano Concerto. So again, a big mix of things, and a lot of conductors like to specialize in things quite quickly.
Yeah. And
in a way, I'm trying to avoid that by being very much open to the different kinds of repertoire there are available.
Well, I saw you're not a foreigner to stepping in last minute and conducting a new piece. I read something. Yeah. How did that go? Tell us about that.
The first time that happened, it was it was last minute in the sense that it wasn't like the stories you hear of Bernstein and people like that. It was, I had about a week's notice, but it was
that's a new still short
premiere.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's still short, and it was a new piece, this Mikhail Jarel piece with the Vienna Radio Symphony Orchestra. So I still remember kind of running to the Vienna Music Library where the score was, and then getting on the underground, opening it, reading it, and then spending the next week or so basically living with this score. But I mean, to be honest, I find that, people do have pressure from doing something in a short notice, but it's a little bit like, if you're going to learn how to swim, you can either think about it and, be theoretical about it, or you just jump in and get on with it.
Yeah.
And I think it's a bit like that with doing something like a jump in or like a last minute cancellation, because in a way you don't have time to think about anything.
Yeah.
You just do it. And in some way, the relationship that you develop with an orchestra actually can be more interesting on a cancellation, because in a way, they're always sort of a little bit more indebted to you because they know that you're doing it in this more stressed environment. So in a way, it's quite a good starting relationship with an orchestra, just simply because they're grateful to you as first and foremost,
Yeah.
But that's, as I've progressed, most of the cancellations that I take over are often with a lot more notice, a month, even a couple of months, just simply because people's schedules are obviously set out quite far in advance, so things do get cancelled with a bit more notice. So that's quite nice, because it's a combination of, first of all, I have to, this is last minute, I have to get on with this, but then you've got time to prepare as well. So it's a good mixture of those two things.
So when you got that week's notice, what's the first thing you tackle? What's the first thing you do for young conductors who have never experienced this, or for people who will eventually? What's the first thing you do when you approach the score, especially with the new piece?
The first question is, I think, is what is going on? What's going to be in the orchestra? What's being played? And in a way, I think, I don't know, everybody approaches scores in a different way, and obviously it takes decades to really fine-tune how you approach any score, but I think the most important thing is to just ask questions constantly. So of course, you open the score, what's the instrumentation, even something like quite mundane, like, well, how long is the piece? I know it's it doesn't narrow it down very much, but actually it's quite good to know if you're dealing with a 15 or 20 minute piece, just purely from the sake of time management and sort of rehearsal planning as well. And I think clarifying, I was lucky to be able to meet the composer and talk about his piece. So, clarifying those kind of things and getting a sense of basically what's in front of you, what are you dealing with? It's a bit like, on a menu, you don't just look at the meat or the fit,
Yeah.
whatever it is. You actually look at what the side things,
Exactly.
the potatoes coming with it. All those other elements are really important. And I think the more you sort of investigate what those things are, the more you just get a feeling of I mean, that's really what your job is, to be the biggest authority in the room on that piece of music. Which of course is harder when there's a composer there as well, but it's part of that process.
It could be a little intimidating.
It could be, yeah. I mean, in a way, having the composer there, depending on the type of composer you're working with, sometimes it's counterproductive to have a composer there, because it might be a piece that they wrote 20 years ago, and they actually don't know or even care about how you performed the piece.
Yeah.
But when it's a bit of a collaboration with the composer, then it's an exciting thing. I mean, I'm doing this opera which starts at the end of May in Hamburg, and we have two composers who themselves have collaborated for this particular piece, and also, of course, they're going to be there for the whole of the production period. So, in a way, as a conductor, the skills you learn about being, the authority on a piece with composers who have died, basically, you sort of have to push some of those feelings away and actually accept that it is a collaboration with what they've written. I know that we talked a lot about music notation in relation to the Guardian article, which is a hot topic at the moment. But actually, it's a good question relating to notation, because it makes me think, well, when the composer's there and they've notated something and you still have questions, how final is the notation? And of course, when the composer's dead, it has to be quite final, because there's nothing else to add to it. But it's always interesting to do that with other composers.
Well, you said you studied in the US and the UK and just around the world, I'm sure.
That's right.
What are some interesting things that you've learned, or some things in education in general that you think could be changed, specifically for conducting? I mean, what can be done better? Is there anything, or do we have everything, you think?
No, I think it's in a way it's an illusion, this idea that, I mean, education is important for conductors, but actually it's such a practical thing that you're doing, and so much of the learning, that sort of crops up when you actually start working in the profession. The thing I find regularly that lacks from any education is that a lot of the time we assume that, conducting 20 minutes in front of any orchestra is going to be beneficial to us. And it is. It's a good thing to do, but it's a very sort of physical thing. But actually, most of our job is to do with a kind of process, whereby we start with the sort of conception of a concert program or an idea, and then we plan the rehearsals, and then we do the rehearsals, and then eventually we perform the piece. And that's sort of the end of that whole process. And that's something which I find you don't always do as a student. And so I think I was very lucky when most of my studies took place in Vienna. And my teacher there, Mark Stringer, he was very good at coming up with this idea of a kind of a concert project, at least once a year. So we were actually involved in the process of coming up with a program, and then rehearsing it over time, and then doing the final concert. And from what I understand, there aren't many opportunities in any music college for conductors whereby they're actually doing concerts. And I also studied at Aspen Music Festival for a couple of years, for 3 years in fact, and that was a big thing there. Not only were we doing kind of reading sessions, but we were also actually doing a concert program, and then doing a performance and rehearsing, and actually completing that process. And I think that's important, and I think anybody studying conducting basically needs to practice that, and that sense of completing a project or starting a project, because it's quite hard to practice that once you actually get in there and start working.
And you've done so many different things. I was reading your bio, and I read that you've also started your own orchestra.
I did, yeah. I mean, actually, at different points along the way. I mean, my first experience of conducting, I think, like most young conductors, it's like the chicken or the egg thing. There's no orchestra that I can conduct, but I need experience before somebody lets me conduct their orchestra. So I have to basically, beg, borrow, and steal orchestral players until I can actually practice. So what I did is I started a string orchestra in Dublin. We only did one concert actually, but it was like a charity concert, because I think the most important thing is most players, at least good players need some kind of incentive for why they should play for you.
Yeah.
And of course, you can offer a financial incentive, or you can just buy everybody a round of drinks at the end of the rehearsal, or whatever it might be. And so I thought, well, actually, a charity incentive is probably a good way of people being involved in
Very
something.
smart.
So actually, that's what we did. We teamed up with the Irish Cancer Society. This was in Dublin, and we put on a concert of string music, which did include. I was a composer at that point as well, so I did actually perform one of my own pieces, which was not a very interesting piece. But there were a few other young composers in Dublin. We played some of their pieces. We did a piece by Legrenzi, the Italian Baroque composer, which was quite unusual. And then Barber's Adagio was also on the program.
That's great.
So it was about a 19-minute or so program of various different repertoire. But that, so in a way that was a kind of founding my own orchestra. But I mean, I wouldn't say it's my orchestra. It was just, we just got together and did a concert. And then later on, when I was living in Vienna and studying there, a similar thing. I decided to team up with a couple of opera directors at the University for Music, and we decided to put on. The idea was to come up with operas that we were going to do outside of opera house, mainly because we didn't have an opera house. So the only way to do it was, okay, let's go to a cafe, for example, or a black box theatre, or something slightly different from the norm. So we did. We put on the Pergolesi intermezzo, La Sera Padrona. We put that on in a very old Viennese cafe called Café Spell, and they were serving and continuing their usual kind of cafe daily activity while we were putting on this opera. And it was nice because we were all kind of students. We had a very small budget, which the university were able to provide for lots of the kind of costs. We also managed to damage a very, very old 19th century table that was in the cafe, because I can't remember if it was the baritone or somebody sat on the table and cracked it, but I think we got away with it in the end. But it was fun, and it's that thing of the problem with, I mean, maybe it's not just classical music, but most kind of art forms. It takes a long time to kind of break your way into the mold of what's going on. And so I think what you have to be a little bit of an entrepreneur in some way, and actually make up your own opportunities, but also find other, mostly younger and interested people who want to work with you and have a similar kind of idea. Because obviously, as musicians get older and get into the profession, they're not going to do things for free or necessarily for the love of something specific. So I think it's good to do that early on and find your own opportunities.
Yeah, and that's something I think some young musicians forget, is because they go through the school process and they get their degrees, and they think that after they get the degree, they're all of a sudden handed out these opportunities to perform and conduct, but you have to do it along the way and just make those connections and do the collaborations. You said opera, and it's great to see that a young conductor, up and coming future rock star conductor, is doing opera and concert repertoire. You're doing both of them, because now I see a big divide between people who specialize in opera conducting and people who specialize in concert orchestra repertoire. So how do you balance those two? Different mindset, I assume.
Well, it is a different mindset, but actually, in a way, that's the paradox. It's not actually a different mindset, because if I think of the great theatre composers and think of the great symphonic composers, a lot of them are, of course, similar. So, for example, Mozart, Tchaikovsky.
Exactly.
You can't even consider either of their symphonies without thinking of what they did in the theatre. Yeah. And at the same time, there are composers who didn't write any operas, but there's certainly a sense of what they might have done in an opera house environment had they have done that. So even, for example, Brahms, actually there is a sense of the drama and theatricality of opera in his symphonies, or in his religious works. So I think it's important to realize that they didn't separate the two in the way that we do. And so from a perspective of being a conductor, I think the more that those things can be together, and actually the orchestras that I find most interesting are the ones that, on a day-to-day basis, they switch between being in the orchestra pit and then playing concerts. And I think that's, you see it now, particularly I think more in Europe, where, you have the Berlin Philharmonic, doing their residency in Baden-Baden,
Yeah.
where suddenly they're playing a Puccini opera.
Yeah.
And the Vienna Philharmonic, of course, do it on a daily basis with the state opera
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
And I think that model is just really interesting and more important. And I think as long as we can try not to separate those two things in an education, then it's definitely going to help. And I think I see it more in America as well. That because of course America has such a great tradition of collaborative piano playing,
Yeah.
as they call it, and accompanying, and of course the really talented collaborative pianists go on and they conduct. But it would be amazing if some of the skills that they learn, conductors could learn, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And so that there's a lot more of that sort of dialogue between the two, because that's something that I think is part of the, and I mean, you could even say, if you look back at, even back to the 18th century and look at Bach, for example, I mean, he seems to have done everything.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't just a composer. I mean, I think he probably performed more than he was composing, as well as everything else. So this idea that we're specializing not only jobs that we do, but also within that particular job, it's sort of, I can't imagine what it's going to be like in another 100 years.
I think it'll change, though. I think I hope because it's become so specialized now. I do this particular thing instead of just being open to trying different things and working with different people, different genres. So I want to hear about an experience of yours. Maybe an experience that for the first time you conducted a professional orchestra or a very good orchestra that you never maybe didn't imagine you would conduct them, or maybe you didn't think it would be this early in your career, and you did something and your feelings, maybe you were shy or you were intimidated. Did you feel any of these emotions conducting a group?
I think, one experience I had when I was a student, I was invited to do a masterclass with the London Symphony Orchestra. So I think I must have been 23, maybe 24, which is quite a young age to be standing in front of that, an orchestra like that. But I do remember, because of course, you get some experiences with professional orchestras as a student, but actually, you're talking about the kind of Rolls-Royce level of international professional orchestras. So I remember thinking, I conducted the Britain Young Person's Guide with them, which is also, I think they premiered it with Britain, which was also slightly intimidating as well. And also, of course, it's a piece that's like a concerto for orchestra, and you've got the best players. There's not a lot I can offer them because they're going to do everything. But I just remember that sound of the beginning of the piece. And in my brain, it's kind of a slow motion where I gave the downbeat, and then the first chord, I remember my brain kind of saying to itself, wow, that sounds amazing. And then the other part of my brain saying, well, yeah, it's the London Symphony Orchestra. Of course it sounds amazing. And that little moment really stays in my head, because, of course, you can't really prepare for that kind of sound. Yeah. Not only being in the same room as the sound, but actually feeling it very, very close.
Yeah.
And it's indescribable. I think Simon Rattle calls conducting, the most addictive drug. And I think moments like that, you realize that, I can completely buy into that idea.
You briefly talked about some of the challenges for young conductors, but any that come very quickly to your mind about some challenges that we face as young conductors? Well, obviously one is trying to find a group to conduct, but
that's the first challenge.
When you do find that group and you're sort of in conducting a little bit, what are some challenges for you? Maybe traveling.
Definitely. That's true. I think there are so many different ingredients that a young conductor or any conductor has to have, but doesn't need to have. And I remember when I first started out, you read all the kind of surrounding literature, and you constantly read biographies of other conductors, and you start to get this. I remember being very intimidated and thinking, I wasn't a pianist at all. I was a kind of second-rate violinist, when I started out. So I remember thinking, well, I'm not a pianist, so that most people seem to have been piano players. So okay, that's fine. I'm not a very good violinist, so I'm not going to pursue that. And then I thought, well, I don't speak any languages at that point. I didn't speak any other languages, and I feel like, well, I'm so much lower in terms of what I am able to do than what these guys seem to have done in their own lives and careers. And I think what's important to remember is that you can have any number of different ingredients. You don't have to play the piano. You don't have to be fluent in Russian. You don't have to have all of these things. Some of them are really useful and help. But I think young conductors need to obviously develop the skills that they have, but not feel intimidated that they don't have this perfect array of ingredients, as it were, because it's possible to do really well and to offer something both to musicians but also to the public that's not maybe not expected or slightly different. And I think we're all we like to look at conductors and think well, why the hell are they conducting this? Why are they doing this? And I think ultimately they have something to say about what they're doing. And that's the most important thing. Irrespective of what it might be they can or can't do in a sort of practical or academic environment, and I think it's hard because in a way when you study, you sort of realize how hard the job is and how much you need to know and how much you need to be able to do, and it's not the easiest career to follow. It's not the most regular, like many musical careers. So in a way, it's like the only thing you have to do is basically love it so much that it's not really even a question that you think of doing something else. And I think there are a lot of people who don't have that, who think they might and try. And I think orchestras especially, but anybody, they'll find out pretty quickly if it's not your biggest commitment. I think that's important. But I think with the whole education, people don't study conducting, and become great conductors, and so in a way it's not the be all end all, and then I think one of the things which is definitely, I presume, has changed a lot in the last 20 years, but will continue to change, is the way that people, how do I put it, the way that people judge you as a conductor. Because it's a very difficult thing to be judged on, and a lot of the time, the sort of application things and videos and things, it's all down to 2 minutes of you conducting the end of Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony or something like that. And actually, this is what's difficult, is that to be sort of judged in the correct way by an orchestra or by a public or by a kind of management of an orchestra administration, you need like years, or at least time to do what you do over a week or over a couple of seasons. And I think that's what's hard, is the fact that something which needs lots of time to be judged on is actually now happening in a minute or in 2 minutes. And I think there are some great conductors who obviously slip through the net of all these places simply because they don't. And I remember Robert Spano, who's the artistic director and music director at Aspen Music Festival. He always used to say, well, every video is the biggest lie in the world, and it's true, because I think this idea that we're going to judge a whole person's kind of artistic personality on this very, very superficial kind of physical, visual aspect, that's unfortunately how it's got to, and I think it's probably fair to say that it's the same for instrumentalists and singers. You listen to 1 minute of a Mozart concerto and then you decide whether or not they're able to play a Mahler symphony in your orchestra or whatever. But I think if you accept that it's a kind of easy, superficial way of putting yourself forward, and don't take it too seriously, then it's very easy to continue and actually accept that you'll find your way through all that stuff.
Yeah. And well, this leads me to the question of competitions. You've done a competition or two. What do you feel about that? Because that's another. I mean, you get more time. Maybe it's not 5 or 10 minutes, but it's still a short time to get to know someone and see what they're going after. And how is that whole process?
I think, well, so many conductors do incredibly well and don't need the sort of the kind of PR push of a competition win or something. I think I did really one competition when I was a student, and it was a competition that had just started. This was in Bucharest in Romania, and I think now it's quite a well-established competition, But back then it was like the first or second year of it, so it wasn't so well known, which in some way made it less competitive, because I hear that thousands of people apply to it now. And when I was there, I think we were about maybe 50 or something like that who were involved in it. So it was a smaller affair at that point. But I think, for me, that was in 2012, and I've done 2 or 3 kind of guest conducting engagements in Romania every year since that competition. So from a perspective of getting opportunities to conduct professionally, at least, that certainly helped me a lot. And I think when I entered the competition, I was still a student, and I still had a few years to go finishing my studies and, graduating. And I think what was really nice about it was, I had 5 or 6 days with a really great professional orchestra, the Ionescu Philharmonic in Bucharest. And actually, I think it was the first time where I felt a sense of, actually, I can get up every morning and do this job and then prepare for the next day. And it sort of made me realize that I loved doing this job, and that it was definitely for me. Because, of course, when you're a student, you do question that slightly. You do your 20 minutes of a Brahms symphony on 1 week, and then 2 months later you can conduct something else. And actually doing it, constantly on a daily basis kind of makes you realize, actually, yes, this is why I've chosen this, So certainly that's a good thing to do. But again, it's always going to be a false environment, But the thing that I find hard, and it happens in auditions as well, but competitions, it's the same thing, is you're told that you've got half an hour. And, first movement of a Brahms symphony, you've got half an hour, you have to rehearse. Yeah. And that's the moment when I think, well, for me, that doesn't make any sense, because what am I rehearsing for? What's the context? They've probably played the piece already, 20 times that morning, and you're the next one. So it's not really rehearsing. It's more sort of demonstrating something about yourself, which is almost the last thing you will do as a conductor, because you're there for the music. So that's what's hard, is when the kind of spotlight's put on you as a conductor. I think that's the challenge. And in a way, I much prefer knowing that in a room, a week with an orchestra, the most important thing is the composer and the score, and us preparing that for a great performance. And as far as I know, most competitions, they test other aspects of things like that. But actually that sort of dedication to the piece is something which is hard to recreate in a competition. But some people are very good at that, and that's also a possibility.
Well, all this talk about music makes me think if you're doing anything outside of music.
Sort of a personal life.
Yeah, sure. If you want to discuss it, it's just interesting to know the life of a conductor outside of conducting.
Yeah, it's hard to, I'd say it's hard to separate the two, because of course you're always preparing for something or whatever. But no, I find when I was a student, I spent all my time studying music or doing something related to music. And actually now I approach things much more like almost like a 9-to-5 job. Not to say that the job is sort of mundane, and but actually I try and switch off. I try and the evening, in a way, and it's a terrible thing in some way, but I don't go to music performances as much as I think I did as a student. I try not to. I don't know. I feel like I'm kind of switched on in work mode if I'm going to see something for entertainment. So most of my sort of free time is I go to the cinema or watch a film or something like that. So I do try and I started cooking. I'm not the best cook in the world, but there's something about it which is maybe it's related to music, but it's, I don't know, there's something about a mixture between doing quite a boring thing, like for example just chopping onions, which I'm going to do in probably about half an hour, but something like chopping onions, which is quite boring, but actually it's part of something slightly more creative, which is putting everything together and eating. And in a way there's definitely an analogy between that and studying music, because of course it can be quite mundane, playing scales or arpeggios or whatever. It is quite boring. It is like chopping onions in some sense, but actually it is part of something that's slightly more relevant and more interesting. So I think there's probably an analogy that I spend a lot of my spare time doing that. Yeah. But again, it's very nice to have nothing to do with music, and to sort of, and also, of course, the outside world. I think, being a conductor and in fact being any sort of artist, I think we have a responsibility to maintain an interaction or even a commentary on what's going on in the outside world. Yeah. Whether it's politics, whether it's sort of popular culture. Yeah. And so I think it's very nice to exist in a kind of vacuum as a musician. Yeah. But it's really, really important. And that's why this Guardian article was kind of interesting, because sometimes our quite sort of personal, almost secretive art form finds its way into the real world. Yeah. And people start paying attention. And that's when I think it's interesting that we can start talking about these things in public, because you do feel, I'm sure you've been on a plane or been on a train or something, looking at a score, and people look at you like you're insane. Yeah. And I'm sure that there's nobody, if you're in an airport somewhere, nobody in that airport really knows what you're doing. Yeah. So there's definitely a feeling of being quite isolated. Yeah. And so I think it's important to always remember that there are other things going on in the world, outside music.
Well, the article was great. I've had the idea about this podcast for a long time, but the article was great because it was sort of even pushed me a little bit further to actually get this going and just find people to talk to about this. And a couple of great people I talked to already, and there's a lot of interesting people who are interested in talking to me. So it's great to see that it brought so many people together, because sometimes I feel we're so divided in the music world. We always find things to complain about or dislike, and we don't like this or that. But it was great that this kind of connected us, everyone together. It's nice. It's nice. These moments are great. I really love it.
And I think also as well, it's probably fair to say that regardless of anybody's opinion, for or against what Charlotte Gill was writing in the article, here we are talking about it, and actually that's in itself, that makes it a worthy article, because here we are having a debate. Yeah. And there's the Oscar Wilde quote, the worst thing about being talked about is not being talked about. And actually here we are talking about music education, which is something that we could easily be ignoring. Yeah.
There were quite a few things I agreed with her to some extent. And I said that I did a little podcast on my own, and I said a few. But I don't mean it in any bad way. I'm not negative towards her. I hope I actually went on Twitter and I sent her a message and I said, "You're welcome to come and talk to me. I really have nothing against you. It's just some of the points I actually agree with to some extent, like I said, but." She's very famous, so maybe I don't think she's interested in talking to me. But
well, I found that the thing about the article is for me at least, about 80% of it was completely true and made complete sense. Yeah. And you it was like each paragraph, you ended the paragraph and you think, well, that's true. Yeah. There is certainly a problem, of music education, or there is a problem with private education, or that, and which is particularly a UK thing, I think. But you go through it like that and think, it's true. But then I felt like I wasn't sure what the point being made was, or what the issue being addressed. Yeah. Were we talking about musical notation? Were we talking about sight reading? Were we talking about what? How all these things come together, and so in that sense, I think that's probably what made it quite a controversial article, because it tried to kind of deal with 3 or 4 different issues, but didn't actually deal with them. So I think everybody's passionate about those topics.
You're a conductor, and I talked to Ian Pace about this a little bit with the choral aspect, but the amateur orchestras, the community orchestras in the UK, are they really difficult to get into? Are they really difficult? Is the audition process that hard?
No, I mean, I don't even know if there is an audition process in many of them. Yeah. I think the whole. This is why it was quite a strange article, because the whole thing about, let's call it amateur music making or community music making, whatever you want to term it, actually it's the sort of priority is not how good or bad are you. It's about inclusion. And, I've seen so many choirs, for example, where people can't read music, but people pick it up.
Yeah.
And it's no accident why, these amateur orchestras, they have 9 or 10 weeks of rehearsing.
Yeah, yeah.
And then sometimes they do. I remember conducting the orchestra of the Vienna Economics University when I was a student.
Yeah.
And they used to do these little weekends away, where they'd spend 2 days, 2 or 3 days out somewhere in the countryside as a group, not only practicing but also sort of bonding.
Yeah.
So I think music education and amateur music making, I don't know how connected they need to be, because they could be doing a knitting class or a cake decorating class, and actually the whole point of it is social cohesion, and so that's why for me it got quite confused as to because everybody says they're terrible at sight reading. I mean, I don't know anyone in the profession who says that they're good at sight reading. So that's always going to be a question. But I think it's like any culture. I think the sort of amateur orchestra and choir culture is the same. And all those huge choirs, also in the States, but also in England. I'm sure there are people in there who are kind of singing along, learning by ear. And of course, eventually they're able to put on the performance, at the end once they've actually learned the piece, But the idea that they're sight reading guru leader and then winning a place in their local choir I don't know which choir does that. I'm sure they're very good.
Well, this was great talking to you. I think we covered a lot, and it's great to get to know you through this virtual world.
It's a great thing. I really like what you're doing, and I think it's fair to say that there should be more of this. I mean, I told you before that I'm a bit sort of podcast fanatic, but almost all of the podcasts I listen to are related to the UK comedy scene, and which is a great tradition of stand-up comedy. Yeah. And it's amazing because there are these few comedians out there who there's a comedian called Stuart Goldsmith who does a fantastic podcast, and he interviews a little bit like this. He interviews individual conductors. In your case, conductors; in his case, comedians. And actually, it not only is it interesting for people who are involved in music or in comedy, but it's even more interesting for the public, and it sort of brings down that fourth wall, which I think is really important, especially for us, where there's almost a gap between audience and musician. Which I think things like this, everyone can listen to this stuff. I think that's really a really good thing.
Hopefully,
to keep going.
Hopefully, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
I really hope we talk about more things as your career progresses, and if there's anything you want to talk about, you're always welcome to join me, and we'll chat about things.
Great, thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks.